Well, a very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this latest packed, standing room only Conservative Home fringe event. As many of you will already have been in many events here in Central 5 or in our marquee down the corridor. Fantastic range of discussion, great turnout, and I know also a lot of people tuning in online at home, so thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of Total Politics Group, the company that owns Conservative Home, but formerly of this parish myself. You all know who our guest is today. I'm sure you needs no introduction, as they say. I've done this particular event for a few years running, and for obvious reasons, the last 3 or 4 years, I've been able to open with a nice joke about what an excellent choice of surname the Defence Secretary has made, being called Wallace, and then assure everyone that there's no kind of nepo baby stuff going on. We're not related. I've had to ditch all of that script, but sorry. Grant Shapps, I mean, where to start in terms of your CV to this date? The party chairman who played such a crucial role in delivering the 2015 majority, Secretary of State for Energy, Security and Net Zero, Bays, Home Secretary, Secretary of State for Transport. You know, your star continues to rise and rise, so the natural next step is obviously a Conservative Home interview in Central 5. So thank you very much for joining us. We have a snappy 45 minutes for this discussion, ladies and gentlemen. So I will use my tyrannical power to open the conversation with a variety of questions, and then we'll try and fit in as many of you as possible from the floor for questions, which we'll come on to very shortly. So without further ado, welcome, Grant. You come here hot foot, not just from the whirly gig of party conference, but from Kiev. And I know it's your second visit there this year, I think, you've just returned from. And I wondered, in terms of what you saw there with your new hat on, with the, I assume, contact with somewhat different arms of the Ukrainian state, with their military, could you give us your first impressions of exactly what condition you found and how you felt actually that your change in role had changed that?
Yes. First of all, great to be here. Thanks very much, and always a big fan of Con Home. Read it every day, of course. Don't test me though. Actually, I just want to say first of all, it's an absolute honour to be Defence Secretary, and someone sort of rather cruelly sort of noted that I've been in most jobs, and I may not know about defence, but I know about remaining in government or self-defence or something. But I think that the truth is actually the first job of any government is to secure its own borders, and that's what defence is about, and this is why this is the most important role in my view in any government, and I treat it incredibly seriously as a result. And that's why one of the first things I wanted to do was to go back out to Kyiv. I'd only been there last month, or August now. So I went straight back. The first thing to know, I mean, so I wasn't surprised about this, but the first thing to know is when you go to Kyiv, it's not what you might imagine, which before I'd been initially, I imagined I would be seeing some buildings which were demolished, not least because I'd had a Ukrainian family live with us for a year, and they described that they fled the country when across the road from Nikita, the 6-year-old's nursery, the building had been bombed out, the apartment block. So I expected to see it. I went to his kindergarten, but actually it was entirely rebuilt and re-inhabited in an incredibly short time. We could learn a lot about planning from what happens there. And actually, generally, it's a cafe society. There are people on the streets. It's a bustling society. You could be in Prague or some other European capital, but only air raid sirens go off periodically, and people may or may not go for cover at that time. The difference about the visit this time was going to see President Zelensky directly, and he asked me to pass a message back, actually, which I didn't include in my speech yesterday, but I'll just mention, which is he said to me directly, Britain has been absolutely at the forefront, and we owe our freedom to the leadership you've shown. When this war is over, there'll be a new chapter written about Ukraine, and the first page will be left blank, and we'll ask the United Kingdom to write it. That is the extent of their gratefulness to this country and this Conservative government.
Thank you. And obviously, as part of that visit, as part of those discussions, obviously forefront in your mind, forefront in President Zelensky's mind is what aid comes next, what future development can we do to build on that legacy. There's been a bit of a is spat too strong a word? A difference of opinion, should we say, about training in Ukraine? Obviously, you made your remarks about the prospect of Britain delivering training in Ukraine, and the Prime Minister seems to have a slightly different...
No, I'm very, very pleased to clear this one up for you. The Sunday Telegraph erroneously wrote a headline which bore no connection to any of the transcript or anything that had been discussed. In fact, I've just had lunch with them, and they rather... They just said let's move on from Saturday.
Lunch with no pudding.
Yes, yeah. There was no basis to it at all, and they changed the headline. They just realised they'd made a mistake. I actually think they may have somewhere in the organisation got confused between sending troops to Kosovo, which was a troop deployment that I announced yesterday, and I think they may have just simply somehow. I don't know, whoever writes the headlines. So there's no basis to the story at all. I was at Salisbury Plain, and behind me there were Ukrainian troops being trained. The figure you may be familiar with is sort of 25,000 or 30,000. In fact, we've trained since before the war, because we've been training since 2014, 15, 50,000 Ukrainian troops. And the only comment on the subject I made is that ultimately, of course, they'll want to be able to train more in country, which means us training the Ukrainian trainers to do that. But I'm afraid it was just a mistaken headline. In fairness to the Sunday Telegraph, they fixed it immediately and no one else wrote it up. It just wasn't true. That was the thing.
Blooming journalists. But on that topic of future gifts or future supply, not gifts isn't the right word, future supply of weapons, of military support, infrastructure in addition to training, where are we on this now in the Western Alliance? And is there a prospect of a step change from what has been absolutely vital support before the war, as you mentioned, immediately in the run-up to Vladimir Putin's latest invasion of Ukraine, and then, of course, since? We have this ongoing scourge, and you talk to Ukrainian Voice. I know the ambassador's in the room. I'm not speaking for him, but a variety of Ukrainian voices. And there is a degree of frustration that the West feels like it gives what's just about necessary in the short term and has to be dragged over the line repeatedly, whether it's about modern heavy armour, whether it's about long-distance missiles, whether it's about further future issues with aeroplanes, other supplies which are still being debated, that Ukraine has to fight and fight and fight for months on end to get something eventually that, had the West changed its approach and decided it would give something up front, greenlight something up front, would already be making a difference on the front line.
Yeah. Well, look, I recognise some of what you're saying, but not when it comes to the United Kingdom. We have been absolutely at the forefront and ahead of the game on this. So, we were donating NLAWs, which are the anti-tank systems, very, very effective, in advance of the conflict, very wisely. Ben Wallace did a great job with that. I supported him in cabinet on those decisions. We, in every way, not just military equipment. Day one, on the 24th of February 2022, I was speaking to my then Ukrainian opposite number, who's now Deputy Prime Minister Kubrikov. He was in a field outside Kyiv, not quite sure whether the capital would come under immediate attack. I immediately said to him, the first thing I'm going to do is close our airspace to Russian aircraft. I'm going to close our ports, which we did a week or so later. In other words, the United Kingdom has always been at the front line. First country to send those NLAWs. First country to send tanks. First country to send long-range missiles. First country in every single instance of diplomatic diplomacy, closing airspace and so on and so forth, to do that. And that was very much what was recognised in Kyiv when I was there last week. Now, it is the case that we've been gifting weapons, for example, our AS-90 guns, and eventually you come to the end of what you have left to gift, because we have our home security, we don't have endless, and so we're into sort of replenishment and what have you. I think we can have a win-win for our own military, because actually it's a bit like an insurance policy or something. You can sometimes replace old for new by necessity. You do when you buy something new. So we should get something out of that for our military, better equipment and so on and so forth. But we also need to find other ways of making sure that our Ukrainian friends have ways to fight and finance, including, for example, enabling them to export their grain through the Black Sea. It's one of the reasons why what happened last month, where we saw for the first time, including all the way back to 2014, Russia feeling vulnerable with their Black Sea fleet in Crimea, why that was so important. So, if they are able to start exports, that could fill a significant financial gap, enables them to their economy to operate better, even as a wartime economy.
And in terms of, as you say, the UK being first out the traps on so many of these different types of support, helping to set an example, helping to also, I'd suggest, break open things that are supposedly taboo. Doing X, Y, or Z would be escalatory, and the UK is able to do it and demonstrate that's not the case. Are we seeing, what further shift do you think we're going to see within the Western Alliance?
Yeah.
Almost a coalition of the willing. If we're looking at, say, the UK, Poland, the Baltics, the Netherlands, not least, a variety of nations within NATO, within the wider Western Alliance, which is perhaps willing to go further and faster than some of their colleagues.
Well, I think, again, Britain's shown extraordinary leadership, and I pay tribute to the Prime Minister, this one, and also Boris, for being prepared to do that. It all looks obvious in retrospect. We are obviously a nuclear-armed nation, and, so our ultimate defence is held in our continuous at sea deterrent. But nonetheless, clearly we have had to think very carefully and be prepared to lead the coalition of the willing in doing this. And next week I'll be in at NATO with what's called the contact group for Ukraine, which is my opposite numbers. And it's not just NATO, it's 50 countries, 50. And that's a contact group that Britain established, and we're the ones who ran it initially. America are leading it now. Again, Britain in the leadership, bringing the world together to do the right thing. But as I say, in all cases, we have made sure that we help to bring that coalition of the willing forward. But I'd just say one thing, actually, having just been, with your permission, having been out to Ukraine a couple of times and seen what's happened there, and indeed had a Ukrainian family, a three-generational Ukrainian family live with us, flee their own homes. For people, I'd say largely on the left, but for people who think that from an ESG, from some sort of woke banking perspective, that we should not be investing in the defence industry and we should somehow disinvest with funds, I think they need to take a dose of reality and seeing what's happening in Europe in the most immoral, barbaric way, where a democratic country is invaded by in an illegal war by Putin, and they should actually check themselves when they try to suggest to their fund managers that they shouldn't be investing in things which save lives, which help to secure freedom and the values that we should all, in the Conservative family, put as our absolute principal beliefs. So, I'm very, very keen to sort of put it on record that investing in defence is the morally right thing to do. It saves lives, and poor 6-year-old Nikita, who's fled his home. If we don't do that, he won't be the last who flees his home.
So that step change in the reputation of the defence sector within the UK is quite important, isn't it? I mean, I was at a fundraiser for Ukraine a few months ago with a Ukrainian rock band where they said thank you to the British people, thank you to the British military, thank you to the British government, and thank you to the British defence industry. And there was a huge cheer from a live music crowd. This is not something that the UK defence industry has always been experiencing. Does that present opportunities for you and for the government working with the sector in terms of developing domestic capacity in a way that's not being, or is it really is it a direct risk of being defunded?
No, I genuinely think that the UK defence sector is a power for good, and that it helps to defeat evil, which is, we've seen what happens when despotic leaders march across Europe, and if Ukraine had fallen, many other countries, Poland and others, would have been on the new front line. And the reason I say this in particular is because, and I think this is often misunderstood by Putin, NATO has no desire to go east into Poland, into Russia. Absolutely none whatsoever. We are a defensive organization. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is there to defend, not to attack. So there is zero threat from NATO. There's zero threat from our defense industries. But there is a huge threat from any risk of disinvestment on the misinformed view that innocent people somehow don't deserve to be protected by the military.
On that theme, at this event a year ago, I asked Ben Wallace about the process of sourcing supplies, military supplies for Ukraine, and he, I think, joked that he'd basically set himself up as one of Europe's last old-school arms dealers and been scouring for Soviet-era weapons. He'd found a very peculiar gentleman in Belgium, he said, who'd been a collector of Soviet-era artillery, which they'd managed to buy without asking too much about why he was so keen on it. That's a very different role for you now, because you must be now thinking about the future further development of Ukraine's military, where the sectors are aligned to it. Was there a mistake in Western thinking and Western planning of assuming that the armoured fist was the form of warfare that was going to be predominant technologically, and actually Ukraine themselves now seem to be saying, well, actually, this is about being able to strike deep at logistics. It's about being able to strike way behind the lines, and actually it's Storm Shadow and so on, which is going to make...
Well, I think actually, in truth, if you look at the way the war has developed, it's gone through different phases, and we're in a different phase of the war now. There are fairly established front lines. It's worth remembering Ukraine's taken back about half of the territory that Russia had. It's the Russians are dug in, and progress is there. It's still moving in the right direction. It's slow, and different forms of warfare, as you suggest, are being deployed. One of the big changes we've seen is, for example, this is probably the first drone war, full-scale drone war, and you've got literally Ukrainians in garages creating new forms of drones that can fly longer and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of very strong indigenous production line going on there, and that has changed. At a different phase in the war, it has of course changed the requirements. I don't. It's easy always to be retrospective and say what we should have done as a world and when we should have done it. But I think it's actually also worth remembering, and I was very strongly reminded about this with talking to President Zelensky last week, and also my own opposite number, that actually the world surpassed all of the expectations in its support for Ukraine, and Ukraine has surpassed all of the expectations, which were, by the way, 72 hours for their own defence. And I think of course, we can always pick holes in different, but I think it's worth appreciating that we would never have thought 19 months ago that against the might of the Red Army, that Ukraine would be not just holding out but pushing back.
Russia, as they say in Ukraine, no longer the second strongest army in the world, not even the second strongest army in Ukraine. So if we don't want to be retrospective, let's think to the future. Obviously, part of your brief is thinking about our future defence and security strategy. Obviously, rightly, there's a huge amount of focus on Ukraine security in Europe. How do we properly prepare ourselves to go beyond this? In terms of, obviously, there's a deterrent effect for, say, if China looks hungrily again at Taiwan, there's a deterrent effect of having a strong, robust response to Russia. But what are we doing now to prepare for the potential threatened conflict of 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future?
Yeah. Well, the interesting, the danger is, of course, that you spend all your time preparing for the last war. And I can absolutely see that in the MOD, not because of anything in particular that the MOD is doing, but actually more because if you're in this role, you will never be short of plenty of advice, literally from generals, sometimes from armchair generals. And actually, I welcome all of that. One of the things I've enjoyed the most is I'm a very keen listener, and I like getting different views in the room. Actually, on any subject of policy, the first thing I try and do is gather a bunch of people with varying views in the room. So I like hearing what people think. But you will get into very, very carefully argued debates, often based off that individual's personal service experience, which might be in one of the three main services or even in a different part of the military establishment, that says if you just do this one silver bullet thing, then that will be defense for the next war that's coming. And if anyone can actually tell me with certainty which is the next war that's coming and what will actually require, I will happily do that thing. I think since we all know that is impossible, the British strategy, which is broadly speaking that you need to have 3 strong services, because to take a silly extreme example, you might be able to find someone, not that anyone's actually said this to me, but you might be able to find someone who says what we need to do is build our army up to 1 million soldiers, because but if you did that, of course the cost would be you wouldn't be investing in ships, you wouldn't be investing in planes, and then Ukraine happens and we're not sending a single soldier, contrary to a brief Sunday Telegraph headline. We're not sending a single soldier. So in which case, why did you go off in that direction? So I think the approach that I think works is to say we should have a strong military presence in every area. We will have to make choices within that, and we do make those difficult choices. I'm rather in favour of making them sooner in the procurement process rather than half making them and then adding extra bits to it and then extending the timeline and then finding the thing you've built's too heavy and then you need to change Ajax and many other programs have demonstrated some of those problems. So I think a very clear line in terms of procurement is helpful. And the one thing I've done is to run a lot of very big infrastructure-heavy departments with large procurement budgets, and so I sort of understand that world, and I think that will help us prepare for the next conflict whenever that one comes.
Certainly. Speaking of people who have opinions, your predecessor obviously has an outing in the Telegraph this week, talking not least about how he had written to the Prime Minister to ask for an increase in the package for Ukraine to £4.6 billion now that the UK has been overtaken by Germany as Europe's largest donor to Ukraine. What's your view on that? Are you writing a similar letter?
Well, first of all, I do, as I've done in every department, all my negotiations with the Treasury in private. I find that is the way to extract maximum cash from them. And the departments I was at always did well, whether that was DFT, transport at the time, or energy at the time. And so I've no doubt that I will be fighting the corner very vigorously. The second thing is just on the German point, that actually, if you look at Storm Shadow, for example, the long-range missiles, we've sent them, France has sent them, Italy may send them, Germany may send them, America are latterly sending them. It will be very effective when they do. There's a difference between, and I'm not saying this as a criticism of the Germans, so don't pick this up the wrong way, but what the Ukrainians said to me was, the difference with Britain is you say you're going to do something and you do it. There've been a lot of pledges that if they were collective from all of the other nations would have already had a lot more arms in defensive weapons in Ukraine. So I'll leave it at that. It's not meant as an implied. For any journalists in the room, I'm not criticising our German colleagues. I'm just pointing out the reality is we have delivered more than anyone else apart from America.
Thank you. And the last one from me before we throw it to the floor, I know there'll be a lot of questions. That coalition of the willing, that support that you just mentioned for the United States in terms of long-range missiles, to what extent are you worried that the United States is going to reverse out of its support for Ukraine, given some of the rhetoric we hear from, say, the Trump campaign, among others? And what do we do if they do it? Yeah. Is the Western alliance now just still dependent just on America being there?
So first of all, I think, of course, we should always be worried about what's going to happen next. That's part of our role, right? To be thinking and worrying about the future. But that doesn't mean that future is going to be just come in the way described. The worst case scenario would be, in my view, for Putin to ever win this war, because he'll just carry on. He has absolutely no respect for human rights whatsoever, none. But I also don't agree with the rather simplistic view that I'm hearing quite a lot, which is, first of all, you've got to do quite a few things. Trump would have to win the nomination. Trump would have to win the election. Trump would have to then decide the policy is to, as you describe it, sort of defund Ukraine. That may or may not happen. I'm not making predictions here. What I do know is that what Trump's been very consistent about is his view on the Indo-Pacific and China, and that he, in particular, would not want to see China move on Taiwan. And anyone who knows anything about these things know that China watches other conflicts very, very carefully, and they'll draw their conclusions about the rest of the world's determination. So it isn't that, for me, it's not a straight line, obvious outcome that there's a Trump White House. That may not happen, and even if there is, that's the outcome of policy. But to answer the second part of your question, almost irrelevant of that, I think it is important. This war is happening in Europe. It is on our doorstep. As I was pointing out the other day, it's about the same distance when you could fly there, which you can't at the moment. It's a very long train journey in or car drive in from the Polish border. But, when you could fly there, it was like going to a Greek holiday island or something. It's very much part of Europe. It's not some distant world. And Europe does need to make sure, because we're the ones on the doorstep, that we are playing our part. I think Britain does, and I think encourage our European neighbours, many of whom are much closer, all of whom are much closer than us, bar one, to play their important part in this, because it is in all of our collective interests as a European community to make sure that this is not a successful, from Putin's point of view, outcome.
Thank you very much. Now, what we're going to do, quick house rules. If I pick you for a question, please wait for my colleague to bring a microphone. Please say who you are and where you're from. And please make it a question with a question mark that doesn't go on for ages, or I will actually boo you out loud until you sit down, or the audience will drag you to the floor, frankly. We can't talk about Ukraine without Ukraine, so I'm going to go to the Ukrainian ambassador for the first question.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Shapps, for all your work in your previous capacity, energy, and I am sure that in your new capacity you will be as successful. You rightly pointed out that the UK was the leader on many tracks, and you know that as an outcome of the NATO Vilnius summit, G7 agreed on a statement to prepare security guarantees, bilateral, and I am hopeful that UK will be the leader on this track as well, and the security arrangements that we will be able to agree on will set the right tone for everybody else to follow, and the sooner the better. And as for the question, the NATO summit was somewhat of not the best outcome, let's put it this way, but at the same time, we are moving forward, and there is this wonderful organization, Joint Expeditionary Force. Do you see utility in that as a way to enhance security cooperation with Ukraine, to enhance our security relationship, to make us more interoperable, and to make us closer to each other in this area? Thank you.
And we'll take a second question so we get through. The lady here in the blue jacket. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. My name is Gali Mishkovich. I'm a bit of an expert in post-Soviet world. It's just a little comment and then a question.
I have to press you to the question, otherwise you'll be more.
How could you tell us what your views on the policy towards Russia will be in the future? Because you've said that if Russia wins, it's going to go on to Poland, etc. I would have to disagree. It won't go anywhere. It doesn't need to go anywhere. It needs just Ukraine to stick to Russia.
I feel like we've gone to the comment after the question.
So please, just on your view on future relations in terms of defense towards Russia or against Russia.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, to the ambassador, it's great to have you here at our conference. Thank you very much for coming along. I had a conversation with one of your deputy prime ministers last week about Vilnius, the follow-up, and what happens on NATO accession and what have you. We all know that NATO can't accept anyone is already at war in any case, so we know that we have to build for the future. And I'll say what I said to her, which is, as ever, the UK will be, I think, at the leading edge of wanting to resolve this issue and be helpful. And I think the Joint Expeditionary Force has shown how it can be helpful elsewhere. For example, with countries which weren't part of NATO previously, but were part of the were part of the Expeditionary Force. Now, I'm not, for clarity, suggesting that rather than NATO, Ukraine becomes part of the Expeditionary Force today. By an extent, but what I am saying is that the UK has a good track record in being leading in terms of helping the community come together in the same way as we've done with the contact group, which I'm going to again. I just went to in Ramstein in Germany week before last. Next week it's held in Brussels, actually on the fringes of the NATO get together, and we will be paying our part in helping to move in the right direction that the Vilnius set out. But this is not this is what I said to the DP. It's not an instantaneous thing, and you know that, she knows that. It wasn't. I don't think I'm saying anything which is of any surprise. Look, I don't agree on Russia. Putin's already, he invaded Chechnya, he invaded Crimea, he invaded Ukraine. He has form. It could be said, and we know because he's written it that his desire is to get back to the some of the borders which encompass more of the Soviet Union. I don't want to overstate it. Either way, I don't think it's going to happen. Ukraine is not about to fold. The West is not about to give up on this. And as somebody whose family all came from Eastern Europe, chased out by the pogroms in the late 1800s on both my sides, this cannot happen in Europe again. It can't, right? We have to stand firm on these things, just as with the current concerns at Serbia and Kosovo. We must be on the side of right.
So sorry, no, it's not a debate. I'm terribly sorry. We get a question from Juliet Samuel, just here on the aisle, and then we'll go along to the gentleman with the glasses in the middle of the front row.
You mentioned Europe has to pull its weight, but even if you take all of the plans to scale up, say, ammunition production, the US is still supplying 90% or more of what's needed. So when are we going to see a scale up from Europe on the scale needed to actually pull our weight and not be beholden to US elections?
Yeah. Well, one really interesting development I was talking about last week is BAE are going to be the first commercial external firm to build a factory in Ukraine. I believe Babcock are following, and there's interest from many others, including, I noticed the very next day, from my French opposite number, who was also in Kyiv, talking about their defence sector and what they can do to help. So I think the answer to your question is, I said before, we're in a different stage of this conflict now, and it is one probably where domestic production starts to play a role in it. America can be slower to come in, but then they come in with huge heft, I think is a way to describe this. But the supply channels probably involve more domestic production for Ukraine. And the UK can help. We have things like UK Export Finance. We have, I think, £3.5 billion available through UK Export Finance to help with exactly these types of programs.
And here.
Thank you. Secretary of State, thank you. Hugo Rosemont from KBR, also in the defence industry, and just building on your last remarks, for those companies in the UK and more broadly who sort of do want to support across the supply chain, including smaller or medium-sized companies, how do you think that the UK supply chain can support those others in establishing, and where do you think would move the needle? Thanks.
Unless, if you pass the microphone on to the gentleman in the green shirt, we'll take a second question as a bundle.
Yeah, Grant, it's around the AUKUS programme, which is a fantastic... I'm from Barrow-in-Furness, Les Hall. It's a fantastic deal for Barrow, but also for Australia. But how can we ensure that we don't have the cost overruns and delays that we had in the Astute programme?
Yeah.
You mentioned about setting things right, not changing the weight that things carry. Well, that's half the problem with Astute, so it's really important to get that right. How are you going to do it?
Should I take those two? So actually, I think the UK Export Finance is the answer to that particular question. I am working very closely with our colleagues on how companies can get access. I think when you go to Ukraine, you realise that actually, as I said at the beginning, it's a coffee society. People are out on the streets. Of course, there is an active war on, so we don't want to start sending holiday makers, but actually, there are business people should be able to go where they are helping with the industrial effort in defence, and so we'll look at ways to try to make that easier and get links. But UK Export Finance is the simple answer to your question. On AUKUS, I just think it is a fantastic treaty. And I was really pleased to be able to make that announcement yesterday. For those who missed it, £4 billion of contracts that we've put down with businesses, mostly with the primes, to start on the program of the AUKUS subs. So as a reminder, these are nuclear-powered but not nuclear-firing subs, which both Australia and us will use as the future form. And in terms of programs, well, this is really where I've had a lot of procurement experience in government. Absolutely what I said before, you spec the thing and then you don't keep re-speccing it. One of the problems and challenges is these programs take multiple years to build, and sometimes the technology looks so tempting because it's taken 10 years to get to X point that you start piling in the extra thing, and commonly make things too heavy, as with the Astute or actually with the Ajaxes or other equipment purchases. So look, we absolutely need to learn those lessons and make sure that we apply them. And certainly, for my part, that is very much where our focus is.
Relating to that point about that question about business, we've talked a lot about the way in which business is a vital part of Ukraine's effort, obviously a vital part of Britain's own defence preparations. We've talked a lot about how it can be leveraged further. It's relatively unusual that business can potentially be a threat to Ukraine. What's your position on where Elon Musk now seems to be, having played a really positive role in many people's view, the deployment of Starlink to Ukraine? Now where he seems to be coming from, tweeting all sorts of peculiar memes about President Zelensky begging for money and so on. Is this now a point where some businesses are so large, one person could become a threat?
Well, I think it's unhelpful to be blunt. I thought it was very welcome, his initial stance. He then withdrew capacity from Starlink to our Ukrainian friends, which I thought was very unfortunate. Look, I can't speak to him for him or his motivations. He's a free individual. We live in a free world. He can tweet what he likes, I suppose. What Ukraine really needs is strong and steady friends who don't waver. That is what you need when you are alone, the only country being attacked, and you're looking to maintain what is has been a long-term war and may continue for a long time. And actually, let's say even if the war was over tomorrow, by some miracle, who thinks that is the finished state? And they could live in a world that's more like Israel has for many years, which is there are skirmishes over the border or rockets fired and some sort of defense system, but the economy grows, prosperity grows, it modernizes. You could see Ukraine being in that position in a much longer term, and I've discussed that with Deputy Prime Minister Kubrakov.
Are you in communication with the opposite number in Israel about the provision of Israeli technology to Ukraine?
I was going to say, but perhaps this is wrong coming from the man who's had 5 different cabinet jobs in a year. But the problem with the Israeli system is they keep changing their ministers. But we're actually in touch this coming week.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to take a couple of questions. There's the gentleman in the middle at the back, and then the gentleman on the end with the pen in his hand.
Thank you very much. George Barnes. I work in the defence industry as well. And I find that there's always a tension between senior decision makers and the Treasury saying, show us something for all the investment we put in our armed services, versus the insurance policy of having a strong conventional force, which, at least in my opinion, I do think is a bit of an empty shell. In your time in the chair, which are you going to prioritise more? That persistent engagement with the sort of integrated review, that Indo-Pacific tilt, or is it going to be trying to strengthen the core of our armed forces, which hopefully won't be used much, but is arguably the most important role?
And could we pass the microphone along to the end, please?
Hi, George Grills from The Times. You joked about the army increasing to 1 million troops, but actually you've inherited a shrinking army. It's going down to 73,000 troops. The Chief of the General Staff has described those cuts at a time of war in Europe as perverse, and Labour has a policy of freezing the army cuts at their current level of about 75,000 troops. So do you think we need a bigger army, and what do you make of those cuts?
Okay, so look, I think on the first point, actually, you set up a slightly false dilemma of, is it one or the other? Is it core of armed forces, or is it Indo-Pacific? These are my one observation so far is defence is an extraordinary judgment-led department, right? Because if you are in education, you can, or health or something, you can introduce a program or transport. You can introduce a program. You can measure what happened. You can report back on it. In defence, by its very nature, how do you prove how many lives have been saved or otherwise by having continuous at-sea defence for decades, or by having an army of a specific size? Impossible to absolutely say. So you are dealing in degrees of estimate and opinion, almost by its very nature. It's why I said at the beginning that I believe that it is right to have a mixed force approach, because we cannot sit here and accurately predict, to your point, Mark, the next war that will take place and therefore what we should have done. So we need some of everything in order to be effective in that regard. But I don't think there's a particular conflict between, for example, an Indo-Pacific tilt, which involves things like having, after America, the next largest aircraft carriers in the world, and projectile power, and able to get, have therefore a base for the F-35Bs and all the rest of it, and having an army, which takes me neatly to the grills question, which is, look, I mean, the one thing I'm not going to do, and I don't think would be any help at all, is to reopen the refresh of the last review, which quite clearly said, I think we're going down to 73,600 regulars, and then, of course, there's still, on top of that, the additions from people who reservists. And actually, there is something, and by the way, I've spoken to the Chief of the General Staff, actually, just to hear it directly, rather than put words into people's mouths. And he actually referred me back to the speech he made at DIS a couple of weeks ago, where he doesn't say what just the words that you just attributed to him. His view is not that that this. Just remind me the words you actually used. Yeah. Well, I don't know if you've read his. Right. Okay. Well, if you read his speech, that is the conversation I had with him, and that's not his settled view, I think you'll find, but I don't want to put words back into his mouth either. But what I can say is, back to the previous point, it is a balance, right? We can have a standing army of name your number. You will then, if you were in my shoes, have to decide the thing that you don't want to do elsewhere, right? So, and that may not even be in defence. It might be treating fewer cancer patients, or something in health, in education, or elsewhere. So we have choices to make, right? And we have to be prepared to make the judgments that I was talking about. And as I say, there's plenty of advice on those to get the size right. My first task, in my view, is not to readdress something that's only just been settled. So I'm going to be leaving that as it is. There is advantage, apart from anything else, in the services knowing what is expected. So I think for that reason alone. But I am very keen, actually, just to perhaps end where I started, to make sure that we maintain the personnel that we have, including the attrition rates, which I imagine are not helped by, are not helped by having sometimes service accommodation, which is below par. And we're one of the biggest. If we were a housing association, we would be right up there in terms of the size of our estate. And I think that's a very easy win for us, and I think we can do something about it.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary of State. I should say, as a preamble to my concluding remarks, ladies and gentlemen, Grant Shapps has to get off very promptly to another event, so if you could all do him the favour of staying seated to allow him to easily get out of the room. I know a lot of you will be after selfies and high fives and stuff. Thank you. You've been immensely generous, as ever, towards ConHome with your time, with your candour and your insights to this audience. Very grateful, and I hope we will see you at this event in a year's time in the same job. So we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the addition.